And joining me from London is Guari Van Gulik, Deputy Director for Europe at Amnesty International. Guari, good evening. Thanks for being with me.
Evening, thank you.
So if we're talking about what the EU is trying to do now, targeting traffickers to try to begin to resolve this problem, is it a good policy in your view?
Well, here's the key thing that we need to keep in mind. To stop the traffickers does not mean to stop the need for protection for asylum seekers and refugees, right? So this is a piece of the puzzle. It's important that we stop traffickers, but there are many smugglers as well along the route that are actually providing a service, albeit badly. And we need to be very careful about who we're blocking into the country. For example, by ending a route that's the only route available to migrants and refugees from Libya. And ultimately, how can we actually prevent this from happening in the first place? And that's longer term and doesn't stop by bombing boats.
Before we get to the longer term, on this point, how practically speaking, in terms of policy, since this is an urgent crisis that's been going on for some time, how do you begin to stop those smugglers and those traffickers?
Well, the way we see it is the most urgent need was to make sure that those people who do end up on these boats are saved. So that's number one. We're seeing progress in that field, which is definitely welcomed and important. But to end traffickers and sort of the abuse of the system, if you will, the abuse of the fact that there are no other legal routes, there has to be law enforcement. And to do that, you cannot go beyond the initial measures, such as making sure that whenever you pick up a boat, you actually pick up those traffickers as well, and perhaps prosecute people who have committed crimes, and many of them have. But what is important, again, is by ending basically this entire route and saying that we have to stop all smuggling activities from Libya, it can actually be dangerous for the many, many thousands of people we know are waiting to leave Libya if none of the other borders have openings, if there are no other routes. So most urgently, we need to make sure that there are actually other ways of getting people out of Libya and to Europe ultimately.
So talking about the more long-term policy, what does Europe need to do? Because Europe needs to also have a willingness to accept those immigrants into its waters, into its territory.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ultimately, we're going to need to see more safe and legal routes for a specific group. We're talking about one group, and that's the group that needs and has the right to protection, to asylum. And from that group, we need to see a higher number of resettled people in Europe. Ultimately, it's an inconvenient truth, but this flow is continuing, it's increasing. We're going to have to up those numbers. Europe is not taking its fair share. We know that many millions are taken in by Lebanon, by other countries bordering Syria, for example, and Europe has to include more people in its borders. There's no other way around it, and that has to happen soon.
Guari Van Gulik, thanks very much for this.